Something strange has been happening to a lot of jobs lately. Not the thing people were promised. The promise was simple enough. Better tools should mean less work. Automation would take the repetitive parts. AI would handle the tedious parts. The hours saved would eventually become breathing room. But for a growing number of people, something almost backwards seems to be happening. The tool gets better. The work gets faster. And somehow, the job gets bigger. They finish the report in 40 minutes instead of 3 hours, so now there is time to build the presentation too. They pull the data in 15 minutes instead of waiting for someone else to send it, so now they are expected to make sense of the numbers as well. They can draft an email in 30 seconds, so answering 20 more emails no longer seems unreasonable. Nothing dramatic happens. Nobody walks into the office and says, "Your job has just been expanded." Instead, one small responsibility becomes easy enough to absorb. Then another. Then another. And eventually they look at the shape of their working day and realize that the job they were hired to do has quietly become 3 jobs. The strange part is that, on paper, they are doing better than ever. They are faster. They are more productive. They can produce more. And yet, somewhere between the new tool and the next deadline, a question begins to appear. I got so much faster this year. So why do I feel like I'm behind? Maybe the problem isn't that people are failing to keep up. Maybe something else is happening. Maybe every time a tool makes one part of a job easier, it quietly makes the next part of the job easier to demand. And if that is true, then AI isn't simply changing how people work. It may be changing what counts as a normal amount of work in the first place. A few years ago, the boundaries around many knowledge jobs were easier to see. They wrote the report. Someone else built the presentation. Someone else pulled the numbers. Someone else handled the client escalation. Someone else knew how to turn raw data into a financial model. Someone else knew how to edit the video. The divisions weren't always perfect, but they were visible. A role had an edge. And an edge does something important. It tells everyone where one responsibility ends and another begins. Then the tools started making those edges cheaper to cross. The designer could now produce a rough analysis. The marketer could now generate a first-pass presentation. The analyst could now write the explanation. The manager could now summarize the meeting, rewrite the proposal, generate the spreadsheet, and prepare the follow-up email without waiting for anyone else. None of these individual actions is unreasonable. That's precisely why the larger change is so difficult to notice. If a task used to take 6 hours and now takes 20 minutes, asking the same person to do it doesn't feel like giving them another job. It feels like giving them a small task. And if another task takes 10 minutes, that doesn't feel like another job either. The problem only becomes visible when 20 minutes, plus 10 minutes, plus 15 minutes, plus another 20 minutes start becoming an entire second role. By then, the boundary has already moved. There is something particularly strange about this from the inside. Because I can look at a task that used to take me 3 hours and feel genuinely grateful that it now takes 30 minutes. And then, almost immediately, another thought appears. If it only takes 30 minutes now, why wouldn't I do one more? That thought doesn't feel like pressure. It feels like common sense. And that is what makes it dangerous. Here's the contradiction. If AI really saves time, where does the saved time go? That's a surprisingly difficult question. Because when people talk about productivity, they usually measure the task. How long did the report take? How quickly was the email written? How many hours did the analysis require? But a job is not a task. A job is a collection of expectations, and expectations behave differently from individual tasks. If a report takes 3 hours, producing 5 reports a week may seem excessive. If the same report takes 30 minutes, producing 10 suddenly feels possible. And once something becomes possible, it has a strange tendency to become expected. This is where the promise of productivity begins to change shape. The tool hasn't lied. The report really did become faster. The analysis really did become easier. The problem is what happens after the efficiency arrives. The saved time doesn't necessarily become free time. It can become an available capacity. And available capacity has a habit of attracting new demand. This isn't simply a feeling people are describing after a long week. Atlassian's Teamwork Lab surveyed 1,000 U.S. knowledge workers in the spring of 2026. 92% said their responsibilities had expanded beyond their original job description over the previous year. Read that number again. 92%. But the more interesting part wasn't simply that people's jobs had expanded. It was the relationship between that expansion and AI use. Workers who didn't use AI were 7 times more likely to say their roles had remained unchanged compared with the heaviest AI users. The more deeply people incorporated AI into their work, the more likely they were to report that their responsibilities had expanded. And the expansion wasn't necessarily just doing the same work faster. It was crossing into neighboring work, work that used to belong to a specialist. Work that used to belong to another team. Work that previously required another person. The tool made the boundary easier to cross. And once the boundary became cheap enough to cross, it became harder to explain why it shouldn't be crossed. Then there is another finding. And this one makes the whole thing considerably stranger. In a separate controlled experiment involving nearly 1,000 knowledge workers, researchers looked at what happened when people openly admitted using AI. The work itself was held constant. The output was essentially the same. But when evaluators knew that AI had been used, they judged the worker more harshly. Workers who disclosed AI use were rated 10 times lazier than workers who did not disclose it. They were also 24 percentage points less likely to be recommended for a high-visibility project. The tool, in other words, creates a strange double pressure. They are expected to produce more. AI makes producing more possible. But admitting how they produced more can still carry a social penalty. And now the worker has 2 jobs. There is the actual work. And there is the work of managing the perception of how the work was done. Did I actually do enough thinking? Should I mention that I used AI? Would they think less of me if I did? Everyone else seems to be handling this. Maybe I should be doing more. That last thought is the one that matters. Because more is not always the opposite of falling behind. Sometimes more is the mechanism that keeps the feeling of falling behind alive. Somewhere else, someone is still working after midnight, not because anyone explicitly told them to. The workday simply never developed a clean ending. During the day, messages arrive constantly. A new request appears. A meeting runs over. Someone needs a quick answer. Someone needs a document. Someone asks if they can just take a look at something that used to belong to another team. At midnight, the noise finally stops. For a brief moment, the job seems to have edges again. There is nobody asking for anything. No new notification. No new request. Just the work that is already there. And that quiet can become strangely addictive. Maybe if I finish this tonight, tomorrow will feel easier. But tomorrow doesn't inherit the empty space. It inherits the new baseline. The work that was once considered exceptional becomes ordinary. The thing that used to require another person becomes something one person is simply expected to handle. And the thing that used to take all day becomes something that can be squeezed between two meetings. The technology has not only changed how quickly the work can be completed, it has changed what people consider reasonable to ask from one person. And that is where the story takes an unexpected turn. Because this isn't really an AI story. In 1865, the English economist William Stanley Jevons noticed something that seemed almost impossible. Steam engines were becoming dramatically more efficient. They required less coal to produce the same amount of useful work. So the obvious prediction was that England would eventually need less coal. Instead, coal consumption increased, not despite the efficiency. Partly because of it. Once steam power became cheaper and more efficient, uses that had previously been too expensive became worthwhile. More machines could be operated. More mines could be developed. More transportation could be supported. The efficiency didn't simply reduce the demand for the resource. It changed what people considered economically reasonable to do with the resource. Jevons described this relationship in 1865. Economists later gave it a name, the Jevons paradox. And suddenly, the AI workplace starts looking slightly different. Because maybe the question isn't, why hasn't technology given people more free time? Maybe the more interesting question is, what happens when something becomes so cheap that people stop treating it as a scarce resource? Think about what happened when copying information became cheap. The office didn't simply produce the same number of documents with fewer people. It produced more documents, more memos, more reports, more internal communication. The amount of paperwork that was considered reasonable expanded because producing it was no longer as difficult. Then spreadsheets arrived. A calculation that once required hours of manual work could be changed instantly. But the newly available capacity didn't necessarily produce shorter working weeks. It made more scenarios worth modeling. If one budget could be modeled, why not 10? If one projection could be updated in minutes, why not update it every week? The tool didn't create the expectation by itself, but it made the expectation possible. Then email changed communication. Sending a message stopped being an event. It became almost free. And once reaching someone became almost free, waiting became harder to justify. Then, smartphones removed the final physical boundary. The office no longer needed to be in the office. The tool didn't simply give people the ability to work from anywhere. It gave work the ability to reach people almost anywhere. Different technology, different century, different industries. Same movement. The machine changed. The pattern didn't. Here is the pattern. When the cost of crossing a boundary falls, the boundary itself begins to move. That sounds abstract, but it explains something very ordinary. Imagine there is a task that takes an entire day. Nobody casually gives it to someone whose job doesn't include it. The cost is too high. Now imagine a tool that reduces that cost to 12 minutes. Suddenly, the question changes. Why not just do it? And once that question becomes normal, another one follows. Why not do the next thing too? And then another. Nobody has to decide all at once that one person should now perform 3 jobs. The expansion happens through a sequence of perfectly reasonable decisions. That's why it is so difficult to see. There is no single moment when the job becomes bigger. There are only dozens of moments when crossing the next boundary seems too cheap to refuse. The information seeker sees the numbers and starts looking for the original research. They don't want a headline saying that AI is changing work. They want to know exactly how the researchers measured it. They want the source. They want to know what the number actually means. The overthinker reads the same finding and immediately turns it inward. They remember the last meeting, the last presentation, the last time they used AI. They wonder whether everyone else is secretly doing more, whether they are moving fast enough, whether the new standard has already passed them. The night owl experiences the pattern through time. They don't necessarily think about economics or technology. They simply notice that the quietest hour of the day has become the easiest hour in which to keep working, and the curious adult sees something else. They notice that this isn't unique to AI. They notice the strange historical repetition. Steam, spreadsheets, email, smartphones, AI, different tools, similar human response. And for a moment, the question changes. It is no longer, how do I keep up with AI? It becomes, why do humans keep expanding the amount of work they consider normal whenever the cost of doing it falls? That's a much bigger question, and it turns out to be a much more useful one. So the next time a new tool arrives and makes something dramatically easier, there is a question worth asking before immediately turning that efficiency into another obligation. Not, what can this tool do? That question is too easy. The better question is, what will this tool make reasonable to expect from me next? Call it the expansion test. Before adopting a new capability, look for the boundary on the other side of it. What responsibility used to require another person? What task used to be too expensive, too slow, or too difficult to justify? What suddenly became cheap enough that someone might reasonably ask for it? And then there is a second question. Did I choose to cross that boundary, or did the new capability quietly make crossing it feel mandatory? Because those are not the same thing. A tool can be genuinely useful. AI can genuinely save hours. Automation can genuinely remove tedious work. The danger isn't efficiency. The danger is allowing every newly created piece of capacity to become another piece of obligation without ever deciding whether that's what the capacity was for. And there is one final question, the one that is easiest to forget when everyone around you is moving faster. If nobody noticed whether I filled this extra space, what would I actually want to put there? That question has nothing to do with productivity. It is a question about choice. AI is not the villain in this story. Neither was the spreadsheet. Neither was email. Neither was the steam engine. The tools did what they were supposed to do. They made things easier. The strange part is what humans did with that new ease. Again and again, when something becomes cheaper, faster, or easier, we don't always use the difference to create more room. Sometimes we use it to move the finish line. And because the finish line moves quietly, we can spend years believing that the problem is us. That we're not disciplined enough, not productive enough, not informed enough, not ambitious enough, not fast enough. But sometimes the problem is much simpler. The definition of enough moved while we were busy trying to reach it. So the next time you finish something twice as fast as you used to, there is one extra second worth taking before you reach for the next task. Don't immediately ask, "What else can I do now?" Ask, "What just became possible?" And then ask the harder question, "Do I actually want it?" Because a tool can give you more capacity, but it cannot decide what that capacity is for. That part is still yours. Maybe that's the part of technology we keep forgetting. The point of making something easier was never necessarily to make everything else harder. Sometimes the space created by a better tool is allowed to remain space. Sometimes faster doesn't have to become more. And sometimes the most useful thing a new technology gives you is not another thing to do. It's the ability to choose. Maybe the question was never whether technology makes our lives easier. Maybe the real question is, what happens when every improvement creates a new expectation? If this pattern feels familiar, you are not the only one noticing it. Share this with someone who might need to see it. And if you want to keep exploring the hidden patterns behind our changing world, subscribe to Pattern Notes. Old patterns, new questions. See you next time.